Professor Feyerabend, you belong without any doubt to the most interesting and most controversial philosophers of our time. You have begun as a pupil of Popper, but you have become famous through works which were dedicated to a general criticism of a program of the theory of science and also of the assumed rationality of science. Could you begin by telling us something about your intellectual development, about your continuous interests in art, science and philosophy from the beginning of your studies till now?
Well, if you speak of an intellectual development, it certainly wasn't like with David Hume, who planned out his intellectual development far in advance. It was a series of accidents. And I got interested in the arts, in acting especially, in singing, because I heard some excellent people perform, and I had a very good teacher. I got interested in physics because we had an excellent physics teacher at high school. And so I took physics courses at the university. I got interested in philosophical matters because by accident, when I was buying lots of theater books, scenarios, I had to buy, because it was second-hand, a whole package of theater books together with philosophy books. So I just started reading them, to cut my losses, and I got interested. And I got into the business of philosophy by sheer accident. I became a lecturer in philosophy because I was in Vienna without a cent, without any money, and a friend of mine, Elizabeth Anscombe, said, there is a job available in Oxford, why don't you apply in philosophy? And I did apply to Oxford. I also applied in Bristol, and I applied in Australia, and by good chance I got the Bristol job. Now I had no preparation whatsoever, because I had never studied philosophy of science. And so I had to learn the stuff by giving lectures on the subject matter. And so gradually I slid into this subject matter and emphasized it a little more, just because I had to give lectures about it. And in the course of giving lectures and also being invited to conferences, I came to know quite a large number of outstanding philosophers and philosophers of science. And so eventually I thought that what they were saying was not so good, and so I argued against it. And this is how some of my papers came into existence, not because I thought I have to sit down and put things right, but because at a conference I got up, argued against a certain talk somebody had given. Afterwards, all the talks were being published, so I had to write up what I had said, so eventually some publications arose. So the intellectual development was simply a series of accidents. I knew that very early, when I was a student, I was invited to the summer university in Alpbach, which at that time had just started and had excellent visitors and lecturers. And there I had still an absolutist scientific attitude. This means when somebody was talking about God or was talking about beauty or truth, then I usually got up and told him that he didn't know anything about science, that all he said was nonsense. I also admired the positivism of the Vienna Circle. And also in the discussions afterwards, people said, we want to make clear what scientists have said. And making clear meant to them translating it into some pigeon logic. I also thought that this was, just a waste of time. When I started doubting the enterprise of science itself, this I really don't know. There was a point when I thought that if you want to find how things really are, you have to turn to the sciences. And there was a point when I said, well, the sciences say very interesting things. They still interest me much more than other things. But they have not the absolute the absolute grasp of truth. I really don't remember. I can't. It must have been a gradual process. Part of it was that Imre Lakatos very often came to my lectures. Yes. Now, Imre Lakatos was in favor of science. You know, he was a science freak, as one might say. And just to excite him a little, I sometimes made snide remarks about science. Now, having done so, Imre Lakatos one fine day told me, why don't you write up all your remarks and I argue against them and we have a wonderful discussion about it in a book. But he said, make your remarks as extreme as possible. So I made them as extreme as possible, and that was the book Against Method. Only when it got published, Imre Lakatos was already dead, so he could not write the second part of it.
Sometimes I have the impression that in our time, scientists are more critical towards science than the philosophers of science. Were there some scientists who also prompted you in your criticism of our idolatry of science?
Well, I mean, there were various people. First of all, one of my teachers in Vienna, who was a physicist, and he was an excellent lecturer. And actually, he was the physics teacher of Popper and of Herbert Feigl, who later on ran the Minnesota Center for the Philosophy of Science. His name was Hans Thirring. Now, Hans Thirring was pensioned off when Austria became part of Germany because of his pacifism and because of his friendship with Einstein and with Freud. And when he came back, he continued his physics lectures, but he had also written a big book about the psychological and social presuppositions of world peace. And he told all of us in the science lectures, in the physics lectures, physics is not important. Peace is much more important than this. Therefore, come to my peace lectures in the Auditorium Maximum. Practically nobody came. Everybody came up to the... But I came, and I talked with him at length. And he also came when I was still a student to some of my lectures. When he came to California, when I was already established there, we talked to each other, and this person really impressed me quite a lot, because he was against all sorts of cruel events in the world, but he was not one of these teeth-gnashing liberals, you know, who want to enforce a certain form of freedom, a certain form of liberalism and peace, and nor did he believe that all the events that had gone by, just the Nazi period, was the result of evil incarnate. It was just of human folly. So he was a kind of sadly smiling about the idiocy of humanity. And he was a skeptic, but a committed skeptic, a very, I mean, that's the only way in which I can describe him, a committed skeptic. And this really impressed me, not at the time, but over the years, quite a lot. And it put the sciences in a certain place. I mean, he was against astrology and all this stuff, you know, but he said, look, I mean, science is one thing. There are other things which are much more important. If you have a schooling in science, you can deal with these other things in a more rational and clearer way than other people, metaphysicians, for example. And so this, I think, was the first great impression. Secondly, come now. Now, a second teacher in Vienna, when I was still a student, was Felix Ehrenhaft. Now I have to explain Felix Ehrenhaft to you. Felix Ehrenhaft was also a professor of physics in Vienna. He had to leave when Vienna became part of Germany. He said all sorts of things which contradicted everything which other physicists said. For example, when Millikan said that there is a lowest electric charge, the electron, he said, no, he has found lower charges. When people said the inertial motion is on a straight line with constant speed, he said, no, the inertial motion is on a spiral. When people said we have electrolysis, but magnets cannot do the same thing, he said he had found that magnets also dissolve water. When people said there are no single magnetic poles, he demonstrated single magnetic poles by experiments. And so many scientists, many physicists regarded him as a charlatan. Now, when he came back to Vienna, all of us physics students said, we'll expose this guy, because we are all in favor of theory and enamored by theory. And we had heard about him, about his reputation. And he exposed us instead. He said, he made the experiments in front of us. He said, now you big mouth, what are you going to say now? What can you say? You have to sit there, you can't open your mouth, you don't know anything. And this was very inspiring. He also did the very same thing at the Summer University in Alpbach. There was a little house where he set up his experiments. There were important physicists there, Rosenfeld, who was, Niels Bohr's PR man. Price, one of the most abrasive physicists in the profession. There was also Turing, and there were other physicists. They came in there, they came out as if they had seen something obscene. Then the next day, Ehrenhaft gave his lecture, and he said, in the end of the lecture, you know, he said, "What can you do, you theoreticians? You don't know anything. You have to shut up. You have to remain seated." You see, but we all believed in theory. We said, I mean, Ehrenhaft can't be right. And so we tried to, but it was not possible. So we discovered that there was some difficulty about this so-called truth in physics. And this sank in with me much, much later, not at the time. Because at the time, this was a very interesting lesson for me. About how certain ideas can get hold of a person and you can't get rid of it. We believed in empiricism. We believed in theoretical physics. But as far as we were concerned, I mean, the experiments of Ehrenhaft didn't show anything. They were just, I mean, it was called a Dreck effect, a dirt effect. Something was there we couldn't say. So this was the second guy who had a great influence in this respect, which came up only much, much later. You see, not at the time. At the time I was slightly puzzled. But slowly as time went on, this started percolating, it rose and made a contribution to all sorts of doubts. Then the third guy I met was Philipp Frank. Now Philipp Frank was one of the founders of the Vienna Circle. He was the successor of Einstein in Prague when Einstein went to Berlin. He was a good friend of Einstein. He was a physicist, and he was also a founder of the Vienna Circle, of the first Vienna Circle, which started a few years before the traditionally so-called Vienna Circle, and of the second Vienna Circle, and became professor in Harvard. I came to know him, and I listened to a lecture of his in Alpbach. And there he said, "Look, my dear friends, everybody talks about the Copernican revolution. And everybody talks about how bad Aristotle was. And everybody at the same time says that scientists are empiricists. But if you look at it, Aristotle was the real empiricist. So the Aristotelian arguments were really good arguments. So if Copernicus won, he did not win because of empiricism, but because of something else." This was another element which lingered and started festering only later on. My first aggressiveness went against philosophers who started talking about the sciences without really knowing very much about them, as at that time many philosophers didn't. I mean, they just said we have to reconstruct what the scientists say and so on, but they didn't do it very well. So actually, if you read it, you know, against method is mostly against philosophy of science as a way of making meaningful the complicated things which scientists say. And what I say there, and also of revealing the method underlying the sciences. And what I say there is no such method actually. And that is also nothing new, because I mean, many scientists said that. I mean, Einstein said very often, he said that, well, compare a scientist with an epistemologist. A scientist faces a complicated situation. So in order to get somewhere in this situation, he cannot use a simple rule. He has to be an opportunist. That is the word that Einstein uses. So, I mean, actually, so when I say against method, there is no method, this is something which many scientists had already said before. It was nothing new, although it was something new, apparently, to the philosophical community. And now, most historians of science nowadays, I mean, take it for granted that you can't simply set up a rule and then say that this is what science follows. Besides, by now people have discovered that the word science covers many things. Look, there is macroeconomics, there is Konrad Lorenz with his geese, there is physics. I mean, there is topology, which is also a science. There is theology. Theology was one of the early sciences, you know. Are they all the same thing? Far from. Far from it. So all this taken together made me first doubtful of philosophy. And secondly, you know, the idea that you find a concentration of truth in science is an idea of philosophers. It is the idea already of Immanuel Kant, and then of philosophers who follow him. And then it got hold of some scientists, not of all of them, but of some of them who took over this dogmatism from the philosophers. Otherwise, you see many scientists say we don't know what we are about, we don't understand the matter. When the quantum theory came out, for the first time people said, well, we know how to work with it. We know how to interpret some experiments, but what it means overall, we have no idea. So taking all these things together then, and Imre Lakatos, write that book, don't make it another shade of gray, I want to be able to attack something, you know, which made it a little more radical, brought out this first book. It was all a series of accidents, also stylistic considerations when, for example, I can argue something or I can tell a story. I take a story. If I can say something softly, and if I can say something, I mean, a little more wickedly, I prefer to say it in the wicked fashion. So all this work together to create this book. Well, you see, I mean, my difficulty is the notion of truth. I do understand, and everybody understands, what it means to say the truth before a judge. You know, you are supposed to say the truth, nothing but the truth. That's very clear. You are not supposed to lie. You are supposed to try to remember it well, and you are not supposed to leave anything out, which you think is relevant. Of course, you may forget it, you know, but now to speak of the truth of science. Now look, take any scientific discipline, it contains approaches which are in conflict with each other. For a long time, quantum theory and relativity were in conflict with each other. Now people try to iron out this conflict, I mean, with new kinds of theoretical approaches. Both belong to science. But if these two things are in conflict, they cannot say that within physics we find the truth. We find all sorts of interesting stories to tell within certain restricted domains, but the truth, what can you say? An important part of the scientific approach for many people, not by no means for all, is that science must be mathematical. I mean, the book of nature is written in mathematical symbols and so on. Well, what is this? Is this a scientific theory? Is this true? Is this not true? It's very difficult to find out, because when some scientists go over to more qualitative considerations, mathematicians catch up with them and provide a theory of these qualitative considerations. In the case of celestial mechanics, it was topology. For a long time, the problem of the stability of the planetary system was not solved in a satisfactory way. So, quantitatively, by means of serious developments, I mean, the series were supposed to converge and give you a certain number for certain parameters. Now, this ran into difficulty. So some people say, let's consider the whole thing qualitatively, not exactly on what trajectory the planets are running around the sun, but on the whole qualitatively, how the planetary system breathes, as it were, and if in breathing it suddenly will explode. That was Poincaré's approach, but this qualitative approach was also mathematized. So you cannot say this idea can be refuted, because mathematics changes all the time. So it may be a guiding, how should I say, a guiding idea which advises mathematicians on what areas to concentrate, I mean, those areas where the existing forms of mathematics do not work. So the whole thing seems to be tautologous. So it's not easy to speak about the truth within the sciences. Then in 19th century physics, in any period, in a specific science, you had different approaches with conflicting methodologies and conflicting results. Now you go outside physics into biology. For a long time there seemed to be a conflict. Now with molecular biology the situation is a little different. Now if you go from out there into economics, well, I mean, the situation is entirely different. Or into research like Konrad Lorenz with his animals, which seems to be like old naturalism, where you simply crawl around in the grass, you know, and let geese follow you and quack to them and see what they are doing. And entirely different approach. So there is not this one thing, science, which has the truth. I mean, this is a completely superficial description of the whole situation. So the results in quantum theory is that, I mean, an absolutely well-defined position is not possible. In relativity, that is assumed, you know. It's not only methods, but also results in basic assumptions. I mean, which are different in different areas of the sciences. And so to speak of science, this is talking about a chimera. An entity, a coherent entity, science, which has the truth, or is supposed to have, does not exist. And if it exists, then one wouldn't know what it means that it has the truth. I mean, what does it mean? Does it mean that when we study it, we get happier, we are more efficient? Well, even the most truthful parts of science are not very efficient. Things collapse all the time, even in areas where people say, now we found out after all, because it's an engineering problem. And engineering problems are very difficult. So what does this talk about truth mean? What does this talk about science as a unity mean? To me, these are all chimeras. I understand the PR aspect of truth. If somebody says the truth lies here, then the result is money will go there. People will study it more frequently and so on. But apart from that, and apart from the concrete usage of the word truth, namely, well, tell me the truth, really, have you had an affair while I was away, you know? Apart from that, and therefore the whole question, does science have the truth? Does myth have the truth? Also doesn't make much sense to me, you know. What would make sense to me is it better to devote oneself or to devote the whole efforts of a society, of a group, and so on, to the sciences, now in the plural, or to something myth, or do we need both and so on? For example, now, I mean, sciences are needed for ecological purposes. And you see, nowadays the situation is so that so many products of science are sitting around. The droppings of science are all over the place. And as only the scientists can deal with the droppings of science, we need them, you know? It is like somebody, I mean, somebody has found a particular kind of paint that can't be washed off the wall. So, in order to get these paintings off the wall, if one doesn't like them anymore, you need the same guys who put them there because they know something about this paint. So this is one of the reasons why we still need this. What I would say is that as many sciences are run today, not all of them, a little bit of poetry does a lot to loosen things a little up and to get things a little into perspective. You see, a myth can be just as oppressive as a scientific theory. And as a matter of fact, they have been oppressive. They have put people into very strange states of mind and have made them behave in very strange ways. And then the Nazi myth, which is not a myth in the grand, is one example. So you have to be more specific. You cannot say science and myth because there are many different kinds of myth. What myth? What particular kind of science? Why? And so on. So general questions, science or myth, I don't think that makes much much sense to discuss those, although these are the questions which philosophers mostly discuss. Look, for example, there is still something else. More recently, historians of science have found out, I mean, actually it was there for everyone to see, that science is not, in the Vienna Circle, science was a system of statements. Discussing science was for many people of the Vienna Circle, for Carnap, for Popper, for Hempel, discussing special systems of statements. And bringing order into science meant bringing order into these systems of statements. This assumes that whatever goes on in science is always above board, that people don't act because for reasons which are not clear to themselves. It also assumes that making experiments is a simple matter. But if you look at the large experiments today, which are like industrial plants, like in CERN, there are whole industrial plants running and people have to agree with each other about certain things. Compromises have to make something work, something doesn't work, lots of guesswork is there. There is not enough money, so suddenly one has to change the approach in midstream. And besides, every experimentalist who deals with an instrument has lots of what Polanyi has called tacit knowledge. Like a race car driver. A race car driver could not tell you in detail all the things he knows. He can show it to you by driving the race car in certain extreme situations. The same happens with scientists. So there are so many components in the sciences that nowadays some historians of science say that the experimental level is a whole culture by itself, and the connection of the experimental level with what is called theory, which what many people regard as the most important thing, but it's very difficult to figure out. Actually, the transition contains many arbitrary elements, so-called approximations, and So if you look at all these things, this whole unity science falls apart into different sciences. Then among the different sciences we have the theoretical level, and the theoretical level is subdivided into, let us say, elementary particle physics, high theory, that's how it is called, phenomenology. These are the guys who do the curve fitting, they still don't do any experiment, and then the guys who do the experiment and are fed some information by the curve fitters and by the high theoreticians, and they are exchange persons, and there are lots of things. Sometimes announcing a certain scientific results is like conducting a political treaty between different kinds of parties, where one of them gives a little here, one of them gives a little there, and finally, well, at last we can publish. You see, one of the difficulties which made Newton assume that God interfered into the course of the planets was the so-called great inequality of Jupiter and Saturn. It seemed that Jupiter and Saturn in the course of time moved farther and farther away from each other. Now, Newton knew from ancient observations, Babylonian observations, which he got via Ptolemy, that in antiquity the planetary system was more or less the same as it is today. On the other hand, there was this tendency of falling apart. So he concluded that God periodically put the planetary system in order. Now there were some other people who said, we shall use Newton's theory and eventually we shall find that this can be explained by physics and we do not need divine interference. And it took more than 200 years until the people got there, but they never lost their confidence that this difficulty could be solved. So difficulties can exist for centuries, and nevertheless people for some metaphysical reason believe that a certain theory is correct and then in the end turn out to be correct. Another example is the early history of wave mechanics. Well, Schrödinger believed for some time that there were waves, that elementary particles had a wave-like nature. And he worked out the hydrogen spectrum on that basis, and relativistically taking into consideration Einstein's discoveries. And he got completely wrong values because the spectrum was known very well. Did he retreat? Did he say, I'm wrong? No. He made a step back. He said, I shall not work according to Einstein, I shall work according to pre-Einstein. This means he made his theory worse according to what everybody believed at the time. And the worse theory worked better than the better theory, which was explained much, much later. So the idea that if there is a conflicting evidence, you have to give up a theory, people never stuck to it. And contradicting it, they made progress. Sometimes it led somewhere, sometimes it didn't, so you cannot. What you have to do is decide from case to case, and you have to know the case in detail, what you are going to do. Now, it's quite useful in this connection to have, as it were, a toolbox of methodological rules. I mean, it's just like rules of thumb. Shall I use this rule now? Shall I use that rule? That is very useful. So in this respect, that Popper introduced into the toolbox the rule of falsification was a very useful addition. His fault was to assume this is the only useful instrument, the only useful tool to apply to theories. That was his fault. Instead of saying, well, we have increased our toolbox. You see, never throw away the toolbox. I would not say give up all methods. Never throw away the toolbox. Never declare the toolbox itself to be the one right thing or one tool in it. But use it, extend it, disregard it sometimes according to the case with which you are dealing, because you never know what you will run into. It's exactly the same thing as if you start first studying psychology, you know, before getting in touch with human beings and then trying to approach them according to the rules of the psychology you have learned. The best thing is to go right at it, and then you will find that many of the rules of psychology you may have learned don't work so well with real human beings. Some people will say that is such a clumsy theory, the other one is much more elegant. Then some people will object, but look, I mean, this clumsy theory fits the facts better. And then the reply will be, of course it fits the facts better because it's so clumsy, you know. The elegant one, I mean, has and so on. Many people make judgments of this kind, and the results of the research are the results of having applied judgments of this kind. But this does not mean that there exists a canon which establishes from 1 to 5, let us see, all the judgments that can be made must be applied under all circumstances. You know, for example, Dirac, when he talked about the Schrödinger case, he said Schrödinger was quite right. to stick to his theory because it was beautiful. For him, the beauty of the mathematical expressions of a theory was a important criterion. And some people really say, I don't like the theory, it's an ugly theory, it's not hanging together very well, it may fit the facts, but I want something better. So these judgments occur every time, but there is no way of justifying any one of those judgments in a general way. You can justify it in the presence of the case, and then sooner or later you come back to your own preferences. You know, some people, the real empiricists, you know, for example, one of the differences between some medical doctors and between molecular biologists is that molecular biologists want to have a universal account of certain phenomena of human biology, whereas a doctor wants to know what works in specific cases. So the knowledge of the doctor will be much more, how should I say, scattered than the knowledge of a molecular biologist. On the other hand, the knowledge of the molecular biologist goes for simple approaches, you know, and therefore is too simplistic for the doctor. So in some respect, the doctor is better than the molecular biologist. In other respects, the molecular biologist is better than the doctor. Judgments are constantly being made. The only thing I say cannot be done is justify particular comparative judgments in a general way, so that whatever comes, you are forced to apply this judgment.
The main problem of the theory of science is that we have at least two general types of criteria which can be in contradiction with each other. One type is what has to do with empiricism. The theory corresponds to reality, and the other is what we can call the logical coherence, the simplicity. The first is a correspondence criterion. The other would be a coherence criterion. It is not easy at all, when there is a conflict, to decide which research program one should support. However, the best theory would be that which would satisfy both criteria. And one must have an instinct when there is a conflict between the two criteria, which criterion is violated in the more brutal way. It is what makes the great scientist really great. Could you agree with this description?
Well, you see, I think that some scientists, don't stick to either criterion, but have something entirely different in mind. It's also, you know, what you think about the position of human beings in the universe. If you think that human beings are situated in such a way that, now to return to the old business of truth, the truth is evident to them. This means that there was a benign creator God who didn't turn the universe into a universal puzzle, but build it up in such a way that people could do something with it. Then you will be more inclined towards an empiricist outlook. If you believe on the other side, as if you were almost agnostic, that God is far away, you know, and that the universe that surrounds us is, as it were, a mockery of the ideas of the abstract and distant God, then you will think that the human senses are not very good to find out the truth. So it depends on some vast metaphysical background what criterion you will be inclined towards. But in many cases of the sciences, neither the one nor the other turns up. You may have some particular puzzle in the sense of Kuhn, something not very great, but something which bothers you and which you want to solve. And you try all sorts of things out. You do not ask for overall coherence because your problem is very limited. And finally you come up with a successful solution. So this, how should I say, big alternative you present, to me makes sense as an alternative of two positions about the role or position of human beings in the universe. You know, have they been put there by a benign God who brings them close to what goes on, or by a kind of bastard who keeps everything away from them so that they have to distrust their senses? There it makes sense on this metaphysical level. But in scientific practice, some people may be influenced by it, others are not. And some people may not be influenced by either of them and still get success in the sense of those, who support a certain kind of metaphysics. So I wouldn't make too much of this big alternative except on a very general metaphysical level, not for the sciences. Well, this story of the instinct of the great scientist, I wonder how many great scientists, called great because of their other achievements, using their instinct, went off into nothing. Many people would say that the late Einstein was an example like that. He tried to find a unified field theory, having made great achievements in all sorts of areas. Now, great scientist. But he never succeeded. And the young generation, the young Turks of quantum mechanics, they said, this guy is getting old. He can't get away from his ideas. He can't grasp new ideas. So there is an instinct of a great scientist which goes nowhere. Newton, who perhaps, I don't know enough about this business, but was one of the greatest scientists ever, considering all the research he did, in alchemy, in theology, in physics, in cosmology, in practically every area of human understanding. He was a great scientist, and he had this idea that the planets are put in order by the finger of God. Later on, people said, well, what a ridiculous idea to have. He had, for that, empirical evidence at the time, and secondly, theological arguments, because for him, God was not a principle. God was a person, a father who takes personal care of his creatures. This means the universe is not something which in his spare time he constructed and throws it away, like Leibniz assumes, But it's something he constantly works on with love. And he is a father, says Newton himself. Our relation to him is subordination, not recognition of a principle. So there were lots of great scientists, who made the wrong guesses. Now, Galileo is a great scientist who made the right guess in some respect. This does not prove that in general great scientists make the right guesses. He just was lucky. There is another thing. I just read a book about the different types of argumentation that existed at the time of Galileo. Well, this comes all from Aristotle. There is dialectic, there is demonstration, there is rhetoric. Now, demonstration is where you can show something absolutely. Dialectic is where you argue with your opponent, on some assumptions until you reach a conclusion. And the rhetoric is where you work on the weaknesses of your opponent, on the psychological weaknesses of your opponent, and try to bring him around. Now, this person, Jean-Dietz Moss, he followed the relative percentage of arguments through the period of the Copernican revolution, and he found that in the time of Galileo, and he concentrated on Italy, the percentage of rhetorical arguments increased considerably, not only in Galileo but also in his opponents, which is an indication that there was a case that could not be handled according to the strict methods of argumentation. It was a difficult case. It was a case of belief or disbelief or putting your bets and so on. And here Galileo got the right bet, namely something which later on could be used by Newton, because let's realize it. What Newton said about the universe was already very much different from Copernicus. There was no celestial sphere and so on. Copernicus was abandoned the moment he became accepted. You see, once the Copernican view had all sorts of arguments in favor of it, it was already abandoned because already new discoveries had been made. But at the time of Galileo, the Copernican view was suffering under considerable difficulties. And in these circumstances, it is quite reasonable for a scientist to say, forget the difficulties, that's the right bet, and we shall work on it, eventually they will work out. And that is what Galileo did. In these circumstances, of course, you do not have scientific arguments, you have rhetorical arguments to keep people in line and to get followers. And that is what Galileo did, and I would say it was quite legitimate to do so, because many scientists also in more recent times when they are in difficulties, they do this kind of stuff, I mean, just to keep the movement going, because it needs the movement, detailed research, to show that the view is good after all. Tycho Brahe solved almost all the problems which the Ptolemeans had, and Galileo never talks about him. Never talks about him. This is a rhetorical move. He does not argue against him. Tycho Brahe doesn't exist. You see, Tycho Brahe was accepted by the church because the church wanted to be in agreement with observational results, and nevertheless also keep the Earth in the center. So they defended Tycho Brahe. I mean, Galileo never talks about him except in a very mocking way, I mean, just throwing it away. But that was now a purely rhetorical move in this respect. Now, in this connection, let me tell you something entirely different. You see, what interests me in this connection is the church made a decision what kind of point of view to accept. Galileo made another decision. Galileo said the decision which I make should be kept free from theology because it belongs to the sciences alone. This means he rejected any extra scientific authority in deciding what kind of worldview should be accepted. And that, in some respect, I do not like, you know, because if you have a research program, I mean, like, let's say, Galileo's, you have also larger research programs. For example, the attempt to get a good kind of society, the republic or democracy, you know. Now, if some smaller research program is part of a bigger research program, you could also talk, I mean, the theology of the time as a research program, you know. Then the smaller research program must adapt to the bigger research program and not the other way around.
One of the most refreshing aspects of your work was always, for me, your criticism of the pseudo-seriousness of the academic life all over the world. For example, in Germany, where professors are taken absolutely too seriously, and you are attacking this overestimation of this social group. You claim that as modern science had to separate itself from church in order to guarantee the freedom of its citizens, so also a separation of state and science is necessary. Can you explain us more in detail how you see this separation of state and science?
Well, the separation of state and church means that in public schools, which are financed by the state, I mean, religion is not being taught. I mean, it can be taught in private schools, it can be taught in a special way, and the same thing should also happen with the sciences. And there should also more public control of the use of money for the sciences, I mean, of scientific projects and so on. Incidentally, that already happens. You know, just in today's Herald Tribune on the way here, I read an article about pork barrel financing, where certain programs get a certain amount of money, and then the guy who runs the program has the right to earmark, that is the technical term, a certain amount of money for certain scientific projects which are good only because they bring money to his state. So in this way, scientific, you see the idea of the free scientist, I mean, who completely independent of his surroundings, freely pursue, this is very unrealistic. It simply doesn't exist. So what I would like to happen is that this public interference, in this case it was a senator, be more systematized and be more done with an eye to the benefit of the populations in the state, not only the financial benefit, but also in terms of the products which the scientists produce. And so that scientific research be guided in this way. It is guided already anyway. And that one does not take it for granted that science is taught, and what science says is okay. That's how it's taught in the school. And religion is taught somewhere else, under different circumstances, more peripheral. One should teach, I mean, all sorts of views. I mean, the best thing to be, the best kind of education is, I would think, but I'm a complete layperson in this respect, you know, would be that children, as they grow up, are told a variety of stories. They like stories anyway, so tell them many kinds of stories. Scientific cosmologies, I mean, made understandable to the level of the child, mythical cosmologies, religious points of view, all various stories. Then, as they grow up, you tell them, look, the most popular stories nowadays are these. So if you want to earn lots of money, you go in this direction. So that when they grow up, they make a choice on the basis of knowledge and not on the basis of habit, of the habits of their surroundings. And in this way, I mean, they would be better scientists. You know, they would see the limits of the sciences, because also they would see alternatives. They might be inspired by what is contained in the alternatives, and they would also be better citizens.
Would you agree with the fundamentalists who say that in schools not only Darwinism should be taught, but also the creationist account of the Bible?
Yeah, why not? Why not? Look, lots of nonsense is being taught in schools. If you look, I mean, what kind of, what you hear about history, about kings, about wars and so on, so much garbage is being put in the brains, so it doesn't really matter, I mean, if you reduce a little of the other garbage and put that in, if you think it is garbage, you know? So why be so selective and say, oh, but we cannot possibly, when on the other hand, I mean, you teach so much other garbage?
Would you also think that the American model, in which many universities have to compete with each other, where the professors are evaluated by the students, is better than the European one, where we have state universities which get their money from the state, even if they do not actually satisfy the needs of the students?
I think you should have both. I think you should have places, I mean, where people who think they've got it, you know, can go ahead, I mean, no matter whether they bore everybody to death, and other things where they are being controlled. I mean, that should be quite okay. A mixture of both of them, so that the high school students, and of course, you know, so many things are being taught in high schools and elementary schools one could do without, and so many things one needs for later life are not being taught. For example, one thing which should be taught is how to take care of one's body, how to take care of one's health. I mean, some basic medicine, so that actually you can do what mothers long ago and also on the countryside could do, namely heal lots of illnesses. You don't have to go to a doctor who will use the most expensive equipment to get the most money out of you, you know. That should be taught. What should also be taught are the opportunities, and to some extent that is already being taught, because universities now lack students and make propaganda, try to get students in their direction rather than a different direction. It should also be taught, now these are the possibilities for you when you grow up. There are state universities. Now there you will hear some people who develop very weird ideas. They are bad lecturers. Nobody is there, but somebody can get something out of it. Because there were people who were good people, but who were absolutely bad lecturers. I mean, Helmholtz was one of them. In the first lecture, the lecture hall was full because everybody said, great Helmholtz. After 3 lectures, nobody was there. He himself was bored to death by giving lectures. So there would be opportunities for people like that just to talk on a one-to-one basis. And then in high school or elementary school already, I mean, people should be informed about the possibilities to make the proper choice. So what it needs is a different and more rational kind of education, starting at the elementary school level. Also, not this English first, 2 or 3 languages at the same time. And then I think things would become very much better. It is not that you do one thing only. Let 100 flowers bloom, you know. But tell people that there are these 100 flowers, and tell people where to find them, and tell people, I mean, what some people think about them.
We have now just come to one of the most popular of your theses, the sentence "anything goes." You are interested in having many flowers develop, and you want us to overcome the limits of the dogmatism. There are strong objections against the principle that dictates anything goes. If anything goes, there is no reason why you should try to search for better alternatives, so the result may be an absolutely dominant mediocrity. There will be no new theories, and if we shall accept the sentence also in the field of praxis, it would follow that there is no longer any difference between what is morally allowed and what is not allowed. But when I read your book the second time, I thought that I should take the sentence in the sense of what you have called intellectual Dadaism. So this means that not only I should not take too seriously all what the old professors have written, but also that I should not take too seriously this sentence, and that, therefore, you are yourself accepting the self-cancellation of anything goes, and that by this sentence you wanted, obviously, to provoke stubborn dogmatism, but not to develop yourself a dogmatic relativistic position.
No. Let me now start from the completely different end. Let's say today's political position, which is a political situation all over the world. I mean, people are dying, people are being shot to death, people are being gunned down, people are starving, people are, don't have enough medicine, are dying from illnesses, there's not even enough clean water, and so on. Now, there may still be some people who say we cannot interfere because this is a culture of its own and we must not touch any culture which has gone according to different history and so on. I say to this radically no. I mean, where there is misery, there must be interference, and sometimes very almost warlike interference. So I mean, my limit is where people start suffering. And of course, how the interference will be. So you see, one of the kinds of relativism I do not want to have is we have different cultures. Each culture is an authentic entity in itself, I mean, which you may approach with reverence, but which you should never approach with violence, And that, I say, I mean, is a very dangerous principle. I mean, also inside a certain country, like inside the United States, when there is danger to individuals and when there is suffering, somehow people must interfere because there is, I would regard one basic value, the well-being of human beings as regards food, as regards peace, as regards medical stuff, and so on. Now, the other anything goes was meant more or less for within the sciences, not all together. Namely, even take a scientist who takes certain problems very seriously, and wants really to solve them. You cannot say in advance what will work, what approach will work. Will it work when he makes a very rigorous experiment, or will it work when he makes a vague conjecture, bases himself on that, and works from there? You cannot say that in advance. Well, let me start from the other end, not from science and so on. Namely, that there exists a view which was held, I mean, by anthropologists for a considerable time, especially those who thought they did objective research, that cultures are more or less self-contained entities which have a value in themselves. Now, then people who were against the earlier intrusion of Western civilization into all areas, which very often made things much worse, said also we have to respect the cultures. We cannot interfere with them. Now, I would say there is a limit to this kind of principle, and the limit is human suffering. Because today there is lots of human suffering going on because of war, because of lack of food, because of lack of medicine, because of carelessness of the so-called leaders who do not represent the culture, who just, I mean, are power-thirsty tyrants, and so on. And here I say interference should start very soon. There is not that one says it's a different culture, they kill themselves off in their own way. No, I mean, humanity in one sense is one, namely that suffering should be eliminated. So I believe that the various military organizations in European and also in states and in the United States should have started much earlier to think how to interfere in Yugoslavia, much earlier, And also the interference in Somalia should have been done a little better, as it actually was, because there was lots of bumbling. But in such cases, interference is just I don't like to say moral duty, because that sounds a little schmaltzy, but it is what a good person should do, If you see somebody next to you being maltreated, I mean, you just jump there and hit the guy over the head, So, in that respect, I mean, by no means anything goes. Incidentally, relativism, this bugbear of some people, is not, as, for example, Popper said, means you can do what you like. No such thing. the old arch-relativist Protagoras. He says there are teachers. There are teachers, and teachers are like medical people, like doctors. A doctor sees a person who is in a bad state, also according to the person. A doctor comes to the person and gives the person medicine. Then the person will say, I feel much better. You know? In the same way, a philosopher sees a person who is in an unhappy state, feels restricted, feels unfree, feels his life is not worth anything. The philosopher goes and gives this person medicine, this time in the form of words. And afterwards, if the person says, well, suddenly I have such a feeling of freedom, things look much better. The person is the judge of his well-being. I mean, not the philosopher, but the well-being has been brought about by the philosopher. So in this extreme relativist makes the person the judge of well-being or not being, but the philosopher, the person who brings about the change, being guided by the person, I mean, who is being changed. Now, anything goes, you know, when I wrote it down, I mean, I thought more of a scientific context, because I thought of all these people who said to be a scientist, you have to make step 1, step 2, step 3. Well, I said to myself, if people who believe in that look at history, they will throw up their arms in despair and will say, well, all these things were happening, anything goes. Actually, nobody follows any rules, you know, anything really happens. And you really cannot put down any rules. Sometimes, for example, a colleague of mine, Noretta Körtke, I mean, she wrote to me, well, at least one thing you should put down, namely, if you're a scientist, not follow any rules, but do your damnedest. That still does not work, because some people work only best when they are relaxed and not when they try to do their damnedest. I mean, their brain doesn't function well. So you have to find this out in advance. You cannot see anything, so you open up the way against those who say it's restricted by all these rules by saying anything goes, you know. So, that is how it was meant, and that is the limits which I want to see respected.